This video is brought to you by Battleaxe. In this video, I'm going to show you how I rigged up this Ninja Turtles character using Rubberhose 3 and how I took advantage of the Essential Graphics panel to make multiple instances of this same source rig to create all 4 Ninja Turtles characters, which is much easier to do when you use the Rig to EGP feature from Rubberhose 3, which we'll definitely be taking a look at. Now, if you want to follow along with me, you can download the character artwork and recreate this rig as you're watching this video. Just follow the link down in the description. If you're not subscribed, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Let's get into this. Let's start with the Illustrator file. I went ahead and set up all of the weapons that I needed for all 4 characters, as well as different mouth shapes. So if I turn some of these other ones off, you can see that there are different mouths for the different characters, and the colors don't matter. That's something we're gonna change inside of After Effects, but the point is I've set everything up onto its own individual layer. In this case, because I'm gonna be using Overlord to transfer all the artwork, I set them up as sub-layers, and I just named all of those layers. And in each one of these sub-layers, all of the shapes are grouped. So if I click on the Sai, for example, there's a group, and that's important because of the way that we're gonna transfer it. So just make sure that on a sub-layer, if there are multiple objects, they're grouped. Whatever's grouped here will stay grouped when we use Overlord to transfer it into After Effects. So for example, the torso here has the belt included with it, and it's all grouped into one object. So with all of that set up, let's select our layers, and I'm going to click on this button right here, Split Shapes to Layers. With multiple shapes selected, it's going to break out all of those shapes into their own groups. So I've already in After Effects set up a comp that's 1 minute long, the frame rate that I want of 30 frames per second. It's the same resolution as my artboard here in Illustrator. So all I have to do is say transfer artwork, and Overlord will rebuild absolutely every single one of those shape groups as its own shape layer with the names that I had in Illustrator, just like that. Now you could bring in all of the Illustrator artwork and just work with shape layers as scarcely as possible. It does speed up your renders slightly. I actually tested it with this character rig, but it was a negligible difference. So it's totally up to you if you want to work with shape layers or just preserve the Illustrator artwork. I just really like using Overlord and getting my artwork over here that quickly. But now that it's here, I'm gonna do a little bit of cleanup and labeling and organization so that this is easier to work with. And I'll start by just making label colors for each group of items. So this first group of layers are the weapons. I'll just pick a color, we'll start with yellow, and then I'll move down the list. So everything related to the right arm, I'm gonna make that aqua, the next color in the list, and I'll just do that for all of these layers. All right, so now each type of item has its own label color to make it easier to identify. And I wanna point out that the arms and legs, I've separated out into their own groups in a very specific way. So let's just focus on this arm right here, this group. And what I've done is made an arm layer, which is actually going to be completely disregarded. We're gonna delete this and recreate it using a Rubberhose from Rubberhose 3. The other 2 layers are the hand and the shoulder, including the strap. And these are going to be attached to the hose. And I've done that with both arms and both legs. So again, this layer here, it's just there for reference. I'm gonna recreate it using a hose and then attach the other layers to those hoses. Everything else is gonna be left as is pretty much. And to stay a little bit more focused, why don't we go ahead and just hide the weapons, so we'll worry about those in a little bit, and turn off all of the mouth shapes except for the first one. And why don't we just start by rigging up this right arm? So the way that I'm gonna do this is by using the Path to Hose feature of Rubberhose 3. And all I need to do is switch over to my pen tool and then draw a freeform path in the shape that I want this arm to be. So I'll click once for the shoulder, click once for the elbow, and then click one more time for the wrist. And this is where the bend is going to be. That's why we need that middle point. But I'll kind of just line up this point on the path where I want the shoulder to rotate, adjust the elbow point to be a little bit more centered there in the middle of the limb, and I can get rid of the fill. Whatever is in the styling of this path is what Rubberhose is going to look at when it generates the hose. So I'm just gonna match the styling here of the same color, roughly the same width, and I can even round off these caps if I open up Butt Capper, which is another freebie from Battleaxe, and I'll just round off those caps and Alt-click to round off the bends as well. So we've got round joints on that hose. Let's just dock this here. And now what I wanna do is run Path to Hose. So I'll click that button with the path selected, and I'll name this right arm with the shoulder and wrist labels and click OK. And Rubberhose is gonna recreate that path as a hose with the bend right where I left it. The slide is at 52%. I basically want that to be at 50% up the limb. So I'm just gonna round that off. But now we've got that nice bendy limb instead of the arm that we had. So I'm gonna delete that shape layer 1 that I created to base the hose off of, because now this right arm is gonna work. I'll drag this down in the layer stack and change the label color to aqua. That's what we had for this section. Now I wanna match the styling of this layer right here. So I'm gonna solo both of these layers and I'll just move the original out of the way. Remember, this is just for reference. I'm recreating it with this hose. What I wanna do is get to the styling of this hose, and I can get there really quickly using the new properties panel here in After Effects. Right here, the style group, basic hose. I'll just double click on basic hose and then twirl that open to find the stroke. This is what's giving us that green stroke there, the green line for the arm. What I wanna do is increase the taper. So I'll open that up, increase the start length, and then change the start width to be much bigger. I don't want it to be a very drastic taper, just something about like that. And then maybe increase the stroke width overall to be, I don't know, maybe 90 pixels. And then I could turn that start width down just a little bit more. So now we can use this other layer again as reference to see how wide that gets. That looks pretty good. I think that'll work. Now what I want to do is create that outline. So I'm going to select the entire stroke and duplicate it. And stroke 2, I'm going to change its color to be black. Then I'll just increase the width of it to be 40 pixels wider. So I'll say plus 40 pixels, and that should give us a stroke that's very similar to what we have over here. So 20 pixels on either side. I think that's gonna work out just fine for us. So let's close this up. I'll delete the original right arm. And now I've got this hose that bends the way that I want it to and reacts to the Rubberhose controllers, making this a puppet. So what I can do from here is grab this hand and I'll move its anchor point to where that controller is, because that's where I want the hand to rotate around like this. And then I'll just click on the Parent to Hose button underneath the Manage section of Rubberhose 3. So I'll click Parent to Hose. That's gonna automatically choose the one hose in my composition, and I just need to rotate that back into place, but now it's going to follow that controller wherever it goes and even auto-rotate with it. I'll do the same thing for the shoulder layer, and this does include that custom shape that I have. I did that intentionally so that I could kind of hide this shoulder joint behind it and get this custom shape. So if I undo there, you can see that it's kind of poking out of the shoulder there. I'll just click and drag this down so it's hidden a little bit, and then go to the wrist controller and just drop down the hose length a little bit until it snaps back into place. That should work. So now I'll just grab the shoulder, again, move the anchor point to the center of the controller roughly, and then click on Parent to Hose, and it's gonna parent it to the end of the layer. I wanna use the percentage value to drag it all the way back to the beginning, and then again, offset the rotation. And I might need to adjust the anchor point, so I'll press A to bring that up, and just offset this a little bit so it lines up with the underlying hose just a little bit better. So I'll just make those minor adjustments until it all lines up very nicely. I can even use my pan behind or anchor point tool to interactively click and drag there. So now when I bend the arm, that shoulder is gonna rotate and the hand is gonna stick with it. That looks pretty good. I'm happy with the way that looks, and honestly, I could use that entire setup for the other arm. It's basically the same artwork. So what I'm gonna do is select those layers and just delete them, and instead grab this controller or any part of the hose and click on the duplicate button under Manage, and I'll call this one left arm. Click OK, and it's going to duplicate that hose along with any layers that were parented to it. So I'm just gonna click and drag these all the way to the top so I can see them all. It's not gonna rename the custom named artwork that's been parented to it, so I do need to change this to left shoulder and left hand. But then I can drag those layers down to where they should be, down near the end of the list, which would go actually all the way down just above the shell, and then just change their label color. We'll go say blue, and now I can use these controllers to reposition it. So I'll grab the left arm controllers, drag it over here, and then move the hand so that it's facing this way. And I've got my two arms. Now the process is exactly the same for the legs. So I'm gonna just do this really quickly one more time. I'll click here once for the hip, once for the knee, and again for the ankle. And I'll kind of just reposition this and bend it ever so slightly in the direction I want that limb to bend. I'll say Path to Hose and call this right leg with the hip and ankle controller labels. Click OK. And what I want to do is just copy and paste the style that we set up for the arm to the leg. So I'll just select that hose or any layer for one of those hoses, go into the style section and say copy style, and then select this new hose and paste the style. And now I'm gonna have that double stroke with the taper, and I can modify this from here to fit the limb. So I'll bring up the ankle just a little bit, maybe shorten the hose length so that that's straight again, and then just rearrange my layers. So I'll get rid of the path that I drew to make the limb, drag the right leg down to where it should be in the layer stack, as well as the label color. I'll change that to match, and then just get everything to line up before I start parenting the layers. Now I think this stroke is slightly thinner, so why don't we go ahead and jump into the basic hose styling for that leg, and I'll grab the stroke width for both of these and just drop it down to maybe 75, and then we'll say 75 plus 40 for the black outline version. And now my leg looks like that. I think that's gonna work. And I'll continue on with the parent to hose process. Grab that foot, move the anchor point to where it should rotate around, go into the manage section and say parent to hose. This time I'll choose right leg since I have more than one hose in my comp. Click connect and turn off auto rotate so that when I lift the leg, the foot does not rotate with it. Next, I'll grab the knee strap and I'll parent that as well. Again to the right leg, and we'll move it up to 50% on the limb and maybe rotate it just a little bit and offset that anchor point. So now that's gonna bend with the knee, and we've got our original layer there. If I get rid of that, it does look like the taper is a little bit extreme here, so why don't we just soften that a bit? So why don't we go to that right leg and search for start width, and that'll bring up the taper start width for both. And at the same time, I'll increase both of those. So now it's a little bit thicker up at the hip. I think that's pretty good. And again, the left and right legs are virtually identical, so I'm just going to delete these layers right here and duplicate this hose. So select that, click on duplicate and call it left leg, click OK, and then move those layers over and relabel them. All right, so I've noticed that when I bend the leg, that knee strap is kind of rotating up a lot, and I think it's because I have the bend slide set to 52%. I didn't center that at 50%, so I'm just gonna fix that for both of these legs, and now when I lift this up, those should point in the direction of the bend. I am getting a little bit of snapping at weird angles here. Another quick fix for this is to just increase the roundness of the bend by a single %. It's basically unnoticeable on the hose itself, but you see now that knee strap is staying nice and oriented in the direction of the bend. So I'll do the same thing for the other limb, change the roundness to just 1%, and now that's gonna stick with the bend much more nicely. All right, so I've got my arms and legs rigged up. From here, it's very simple. I'm just gonna grab my shoulder layers and my hip layers and attach those to the torso. So I'll go down with the parent pick whip to the torso layer. Now when I move that around, all of the limbs are gonna be parented to it. And why don't I just go ahead and do all of my parenting right now, and I'll speed through this since it is pretty basic stuff. All right, so now everything's parented up. The torso is basically the thing that controls the whole body. The head is gonna control all of those items. I just wanna rearrange the anchor points for each of these so that they actually rotate around what they should. And to speed this up a little bit, I'm just gonna disable the path visibility right here. But there, we're gonna rotate around that neck part of the character. I'll move the torso's anchor point down to between the hips so that when it rotates, it's bending where it should. And I think that's everything we need. Oh, maybe this headband knot. I'm gonna move the anchor point right to the center of that circle. And I held Control or Command on a Mac while moving that anchor point, and that snaps the anchor point temporarily. But now this can rotate around that nicely if we want it to. But just like that, we've got a rigged up character, so I can move the entire body around. The arms and legs are independent, and they behave the way that I want them to. So how do we use this rig for multiple characters and even change attributes of this character without having to create other compositions? Well, that's where some expressions, essential graphics, and the power section of Rubberhose 3 comes into play. So what we'll start with is just the colors of the character. So currently it's set up for Michelangelo, the orange color. Let's create a controller to change that color to whatever we want it to be. And I'm just gonna put all of my controls right on the torso so that they're easy to find. That's where I'm gonna be clicking the most anyway to move around the character and rotate them, so why not put other controls on that layer as well? To set this up, I'm going to use an expression control. So I'm gonna go up to the effect menu, down to expression controls and color control. This is just a color. It doesn't do anything if I change it. It's just reference for expressions. What I want this to be is the same orange color that I already have selected, and I'll just call this color. So that is the main color for our character. Next, I want to search for the word color with no layers selected. That will bring up every single color control in my composition. Whether it's a shape layer, an effect, or anything else, that's gonna bring up all of those colors. And what I wanna do is just find one of the orange colors, and I'm gonna link this to that color control. So actually, let me select that one more time, and I'm gonna lock my effect controls, and then find that orange color one more time. Let's see. Let's find one, there we go. And then I'll use my expression pick whip to select that color up in the effect controls. Now, whatever this color is going to control what that color ends up being. So if I click OK, now it's purple. I want to do that exact same thing for all of the orange colors in my comp. So what I'll do is just undo, and because this now has an expression applied, all I need to do is copy that color control and then find all the instances of that orange color. So I'm going to press the tilde key with my mouse over the timeline. So I've maximized this panel, and I'll just scroll through, let's start at the bottom, and select one at a time all of these orange colors. I'll Control or Command click on them to make a selection of them all. And then once I've made a few selected, I'll just paste that color control with the expression preserved on any instance of that orange color. And that way, when I adjust the single controller, all of the colors are going to update. So it looks like that might have been the last one, because this is the one with the expression already applied. And I think that is. Now I can close out of that search bar, and if I change my color to something else, all of those colors are going to update. So that's great. We've already rigged up something completely custom with this artwork that allows us to make a variation on this character. And with that set up, let's go ahead and take a look at the power section of Rubberhose 3 to see how we can take advantage of the Essential Graphics panel here in After Effects with a Rubberhose rig. So what I want to do is select the controllers that I want access to in another comp. So something that I'm bringing this as a pre-comp into another render comp or animation comp. These are the layers that I want to be able to control. So I've got the controllers for the hands and the feet, but I also want the torso. So I'll shift click on that, as well as the head, and then click the Rig to EGP button. That's Rig to Essential Graphics panel. Now, I'm working with very limited screen space here, so it's gonna be a little hard to show you, but what that did was automatically bring in the position and rotation for all of those selected layers into the Essential Graphics panel. And if you're not familiar with the Essential Graphics panel, this allows you to modify properties in this panel, outside of the constraints of the timeline or even this composition, meaning I could bring this comp into another comp, nest it within another comp, and then modify these properties to affect both this comp and the pre-comp. But it also allows us to bring those controls up independently of the source comp. And I think it's easier for me to just show it to you rather than try to explain it. So with those selected properties added to the Essential Graphics panel, I'm gonna grab this Turtle Art comp and drag this into a new comp. I'll call this Turtle Animation and change the resolution down to say 1080 by 1080, and then scale this comp down so that it fits within the comp a little bit better. Now with that layer selected, if I go into the actual controls, you'll see there's an Essential Properties section. These are all the exact same properties that we see in the Essential Graphics panel, but they allow me to do things like adjust this independently of what's in this comp, in the source comp. So I can move the head's position around, and that's not going to affect what's within this source comp. That's why Essential Properties are so powerful. So let me undo that. Instead of modifying all of these properties manually down here, I'm gonna have that comp selected, go back to Rubberhose 3 and click on the EGP to Rig button, and Rubberhose is going to recreate the controllers for this character. You can see there they are, the same Rubberhose controllers for the hands and the feet, as well as recreate some of the properties of the head and torso layers, which remember is what was driving both the torso and the head, and there are other things parented to those layers. Now the shapes of these controllers don't really matter. Rubberhose is just gonna look at the first two groups within that layer and copy them over, but honestly, I wanna just delete the contents of that and just put in a simple rectangle. So I'm gonna grab a rectangle here for both the head and the torso, and I'll just add a stroke around it. We'll make it, I don't know, white 2 pixels. That'll probably work just fine. And now I have a very simple controller that I can use to modify the head's position and rotation. In fact, I could even open up the anchor point and offset this over here. Maybe we change it to something brighter that's easier to see. And now I have a controller off to the side that I can click and drag to rotate the head. So I'll do the same thing for the torso. Grab the contents, copy it over to the torso, move the anchor point over and maybe increase the size. So let's go back into the contents rectangle and increase that up to around, I don't know, 200. And now I've got a controller for the torso as well as for the head. I just want to point out that I can't parent the head controller to the torso controller, because if I do that, it's going to mess with the system that is making this work, that makes this a possibility, and just confuses things. So I'm gonna leave that unparented, and because I'm just using this controller as rotation, it doesn't really matter that it isn't moving with this controller here, the torso. But I do wanna point out that all of these layers are parented to the actual precomp. So if I move this around, the controller is gonna move with it. I can scale this up and down, I can rotate it. All of these controllers are now relative to the transformations of this precomp, including if I were to bring up the scale and swap the X to be inverted, and now it's facing the other direction. All of these controllers are still preserved, and I can modify this just like any other rigged character without affecting the actual source rig. This is why it's such a powerful feature. So let me get back to where we were. And what about that color control? Well, that wasn't selected when we ran rig to EGP. It was just the torso layer itself. So what I need to do is open up the effects for that layer and select that color control, and then click the rig to EGP button. And that's going to bring it over into the Essential Graphics panel. So I'll just rename this color, and then that's now going to show up in any instance of that precomp. In the essential properties, there it is, the color. So what I could do is move this character over to the left, and I'll just go back to Rubberhose 3 into the manage section and click duplicate, and I'll call this one Donatello, and then click OK. And now I have an identical rig with all the same controls, all renamed to Donatello, and from here I can go into the essential properties for that layer and change that color control to be purple so that it matches Donatello's colors, and now I have two independent rigs based on that same source comp. So that's really the fundamentals of how I've set up this rig and made multiple versions of it. But we can take this even further with the weapons and the mouths, just like we set up that custom color control. So let me show you how that works. I'm gonna jump back into the source rig comp, and actually, why don't we rename this turtle source? And let's turn those weapon layers back on. I'll start with the nunchuck, and I'll just move that to where I want it to be. Now I want that parented to the right hand. It needs to be below it. So I'll just parent that layer to the right hand, rotate this to the way that I want it to be oriented, and then duplicate it and move it down to just above the left hand. So right there, move this over, rotate it, and just get it to line up where it needs to be, and then parent it to the left hand. Great, so now if I jump back to my turtle animation comp, both characters have those nunchucks in their hands. But how do I swap that artwork out for Donatello, who should have the bow staff? Well, let's turn on that bow staff layer, and I'll bring that down to where I want it to be. I don't actually want it in his hands. I want this one to show up behind his shell, like he's got it attached to his back there. So I'm just gonna move it into place and parent it to the shell. And again, that's gonna show up on both characters. To make a selector, I'm gonna go back to the torso, and this is where we put the color control, and go to another expression control. So go to Effect, Expression Controls, and this time I'm gonna use a drop-down menu control. Again, this doesn't do anything on its own, it's just a reference item for expressions. So what I wanna do is edit this, and I'll change the names of my items. So the first one will be nunchucks, the second one will be bow staff, then we'll do the size, and then I'll add one more item, we'll say katanas. Click OK, and now I have that custom menu with all of the weapon selections, and then I'll change this menu control name to weapon selector so I can identify that more easily and bring that into the Essential Graphics panel. I could use the rig to EGP button, or I could simply just right click on the menu item, and down at the bottom is add property to Essential Graphics. It's not showing up on my screen recording, so let me make this bigger. Right click, and it still didn't make it on the screen recording, but it's at the very bottom. Add property to Essential Graphics panel, and now that's going to show up over here. So let's resize this There it is down at the bottom. I'm gonna bring it up to the top right underneath color. Again, this is not doing anything yet. We need to set up some expressions to turn the visibility of these layers on and off based on our selection. So for the nunchucks, I'm gonna bring up the transparency or the opacity of the layer by pressing the T key and Alt or Option click on that stopwatch. First, I need to tell the expression what we're looking at, which is this weapon selector. So I'll type in VAR for variable and make a new variable called, we'll just say W for weapon and then say equals, and then we need to tell After Effects what is W pointing at. Well, it's gonna point at our weapon selector menu item. So with my expression pick whip, drag it up there, let go. After Effects autofills in the expression code that I need to reference that menu item. Then I'll drop down a line and I need to write an if-else conditional statement. If you don't know about these, I have a tutorial, check the link above to watch that. But basically we're just going to say if this menu item, and we do this between parentheses, so W, which now represents this line of code. So if that weapon selection, and we do 2 equal signs in a row here to mean equals exactly, and we're gonna type in 1 because 1 is the first index in a menu item. Usually it's 0, it starts at 0 and counts up from there. With drop-down menu selectors, it starts at an index value of 1. Our first item is nunchucks. This is what we're writing the expression on. So if the weapon selector is set to 1, then we're going to want 100% opacity, a value of 100 on the opacity value. Then I'll drop down another line and do a curly bracket and say else, meaning otherwise, if it's not on the selection of 1, we're gonna return a value of 0 on the opacity, and then finish that off with another curly bracket. So this is how I write out my if-else conditional statements. It makes it really easy to identify. If the menu item is equal to 1, give me 100% opacity. Otherwise, give me a value of 0. Click off, and now if I switch this from the menu selection of nunchucks to bow staff, it's gonna disappear because it's not fulfilling that conditional statement. So what I can do is copy that opacity over to the other nunchuck, which is right here, bring up the opacity and paste. Now that's gonna disappear anytime it's not on nunchucks. All right, now what I wanna do is the same thing for the bow staff, except just change the value. So let's find that bow staff, open up the opacity, and I've already copied that expression. I just wanna modify it a little bit. So I'll paste it, and now it's also going to be looking at the nunchucks. I want it to be visible when the bow staff is selected, which is index number 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm gonna go into the opacity expression. It's gonna be a little bit difficult with such little screen real estate, but here we go. I'm gonna modify this expression. Instead of looking at the first menu item, we wanna look at the second menu item, or the index value of 2. If it's 2, then give me 100% opacity, otherwise give me 0. There we go. So now I can switch between nunchucks and bow staff. I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the other weapons now and just fast forward through it. All right, so now I've got this set up so that no matter what I select, only the weapon that's in that selection is going to be visible. And that's exactly how I need it to be. And now I need to jump back to my animation comp and make the right selections for the weapons here. So I wanna choose nunchucks for Michelangelo. I wanna choose the bow staff for Donatello. So let's find that. And then I can duplicate this again. Let's go to the Rubberhose 3 duplicate button under manage, and I'll name this one Raphael, move it over, and change his color and his weapon selection. So let's close this one up. Choose red for the color. You make that a little bit darker, and then change the bow staff to the size. And then do that one more time. Duplicate, we'll call this one Leonardo. Click OK, move him over, change his color and his weapon selection. And now I have all 4 of the Ninja Turtles with their own weapons and their colors, but they all have the exact same facial expression. And since they all have different personalities, it would be useful if we could give them a little bit of variance in the way that they're looking. And that's why I created 4 different mouth shapes for each one of these characters. So I'm gonna do the exact same process as I did with the weapons, except for the mouths. And it's gonna use another drop-down selector. So I'm just gonna duplicate this, and I'll call this mouth selector, and then just modify the properties, link up the expressions in the exact same way. So now we've got 4 different looks, 4 different colors, 4 different weapons and controls for each and every one of them right here in this comp, all coming from that same source comp. So hopefully you can see the power that we have here. From here, I just kept going. I made things a lot more complicated, and rather than showing you step by step how to do it, I'm just gonna walk you through what I have here and what I've changed about the rig. So on the torso layer, that's where I added lots of expression controls for as many things as I wanted to actually affect, so that when I run EGP to rig, that is not gonna bring in as many layers. I don't want a ton of layers. I wanna simplify it as much as possible. So in addition to the color and the weapon and the mouth selectors, I've also got the head rotation now here. That's gonna rotate the head. That's just a direct link from the head layer's rotation to that expression controller. Same thing for the headband, not rotation. I've got eyelid controls. So I added in eyelid shapes and I matted them to the eyeball so I can move them up and down independently on both the upper and lower, and I can rotate them around. Characters' eyes can express a lot of emotion, so those are really important to have. Same thing goes for the eyebrows. So I've got eyebrow controls for both the position and the rotation of each of those. And I linked all these up very simply, just adding point controls for the position and angle controls for the rotation. And the expressions that I use to link these up are very simple. So on the position, I just typed in value plus, and then whipped the expression controller for that point control. That way, whatever the value for the position was already remains, and then we're just adding to that with the point control, which comes in at the default of 0, 0 on the X and Y. So we're just adding to the values that are already there for any of these point controls, and that makes it really nice and clean. So I just kept adding controls for everything that I thought needed it between the facial expressions. I even added in the shoulder controls so I could shift those back and forth and maybe add a little bit of depth. Same thing with the shell, just being able to move that a little bit, maybe rotate it as well. But they're all linked up to those torso controls. Now over here in my animation comp, I'm just gonna simply scale this Michelangelo down until he fits within the comp, maybe a little bit smaller. Again, run that EGP to rig. It'll bring in fewer layers this time. I would just, again, do the same process of replacing this controller with a rectangle for that torso. So I'll do that really fast. And then to get all of those extra controls here, since there are no effects on this layer, I'm simply just going to copy all of the effects from this torso layer in my source comp. So I'll select all of them, copy and paste. They're not gonna do anything, they're still just expression controls, but now I can go into my essential properties and link up the corresponding values that haven't been automatically tied by Rubberhose through the Rubberhose rigging system. So it is a little bit of work, but once it's done, it's set and you can reuse all of these controls. So let me do that quickly. Okay, so now each one of these controls is going to affect a different part of this instance of the rig. So I could close the eyes, I could rotate the eyelids, I could rotate the shell or the position of the shell, I could offset the shoulders. All these controls now live on that torso and they're linked up with expressions, and I can now go back to Rubberhose 3 and once again go to Manage, select this layer and duplicate, and we'll start with Leonardo. It's gonna duplicate all of that with the comp, and now instead of having to dig through Essential Graphics, I can just go to the torso controller and change the color to be whatever I want it to be. This makes the whole process much quicker. Even though it took more time to set up, now I can really customize everything I want and animate everything with much fewer layers, giving me access to just the controls that I actually want. And when I put all of this together, I was able to create this animation with different facial expressions, controls, layers that were visible, everything completely unique, all coming from one single source comp, which is why the Essential Graphics panel and the workflow that Rubberhose 3 gives makes this such a powerful thing for character animation. I really hope that this video helped you understand how you can create some pretty complex rigs and reuse them using that Essential Graphics panel. It's really, really powerful, and pairing it with the Rig to EGP feature of Rubberhose 3, it just works so well. Being able to reuse that source rig, resize it, flip it around, do whatever you want with it, and really minimize the number of layers that you need access to in your animation comp. It's really a game changer for me. As always, if you have any questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments. Make sure that you like this video so that more people can learn learn from it and that I know that I'm doing a good job here. Let me know if there's anything else that you want to learn about in the future. I'm always open to your suggestions and I really appreciate your support. A huge thank you goes out to my patrons. If you didn't know, I do have a Patreon. So if you want to support more videos like this one in the future, please consider becoming a patron. You can follow the link down in the description. But a huge thank you to everyone who watched this video. I hope that you're having a great day and this video might have made your day just a little bit better. I'll see you in the next video.
Workflow.